Moltmann popularized a phrase called the crucified God. And we struggle during this season, as I shared with you a few times over the past several days, that I struggle with crucifixion. I always have, and I hope that I always will toil and struggle with crucifixion. It is something that, in some ways, I think we've almost started to take for granted. And why do I say that? Because we hear this story time and time again. We see it in stage, screen, Technicolor, big screen, small screen. It is almost enculturated as a part of our tradition. And it even stands outside of Christian tradition and pop culture. And so I think somehow, almost like our murder rate in New Orleans, we begin to insulate ourselves against that violence. One of the most powerful sermons that I heard, which absolutely brought me to tears and evoked a little bit of PTSD in me, was a forensic sermon of the death of Jesus. If you've never heard it, perhaps that might be my parting gift to you next year at this time. Because, well, first of all, how did he die? Well, common myth is he bled to death. No, he didn't. He suffocated. He suffocated. So can you imagine just for a minute the horrors that our nation felt when we found we were waterboarding? And that was to emulate suffocation. It was to give one the sense that they could no longer breathe by pouring water over a towel over their mouth. Can you imagine, just for a moment, and I want you to do that, what it would be like to suffocate? My pregnant pause was quite intentional, obviously. I wanted to, first of all, give you a chance to kind of catch up to where I am, emotionally and psychologically. You'll also notice that when Pilate was pressing Jesus, his first response was what? It was silence. Because in silence, things can start to come to us. The silence of this night is about the crucified God. And while Moltmann might be criticized for a lot of his theology, some would say he was a great theologian, others are rather dismissive of this character who had done some time in a prison camp. He was a product of World War II, and one of the speculations that he makes is that somehow after World War II, after that post-Holocaust period, the entire theology of Christianity began to shift. And I kind of agree with him. We thought that was a once-in-a-lifetime event, perhaps, the Holocaust. And yet, it's being repeated, perhaps not to scale and sometimes to scale. And our history isn't over yet. But he spent some time in a prisoner of war camp, and he came out of the other side. He lived and taught in the United States for a brief period of time. I believe it was at Chapel Hill that he taught. And he was not terribly fond of our cities. The reason he was not terribly fond of our cities is we tend to have one large street going straight down the middle, and there was no town center. There was no gathering place. He found that very disorienting. Shopping malls. In those days, it was strip malls would develop. And if you've ever gone through much of the United States, much of small-town America is rather like that. It's one main road going through town, populated on either side, but there's no agora, there's no gathering place for the people per se. You do see that in some towns, but not many in this country, and so he's a critic, and he went back to Germany. But I suggest to you, and I'm pulling some of this from Moltmann, that at the moment of suffocation, at that moment when Jesus died, that nanosecond, when life is extinguished, is a couple of things. One, it is a very intimate moment. Anybody that's worked in healthcare, I see Zach has experienced it, and several others have experienced it, have ever been with somebody who is dying. There's nothing more intimate than that quintessential moment. And so what must it have been like between God and Jesus on that one moment in which, I submit to you, all sacred history shifted and became something different than it was. Now, you amateur and professional theologians out there will argue that God is immutable, unchangeable, never-ending, and I submit to you that physics teaches us otherwise. In chaos theory, we find that matter is simply changed, not created nor destroyed. We see that when we burn a candle, it turns to gases and ash when it's extinguished. I submit to you that God changed somehow in that moment of complete abandonment and estrangement. If Jesus is the Son of God, if Jesus is both man and God, which we believe in traditional theology and Christianity, then what was it like for God to experience death on the cross? Think about that for a moment. And think about the depth of profound longing and sorrow that must have been evoked, whether you knew the outcome or not. When my father was dying, which was actually a very lovely death in many ways, he had Alzheimer's, and he had progressed, and unlike many people that have Alzheimer's, my dad was delightful. He didn't know whether school was in or out, but he was lovely on the journey. He would laugh, and he enjoyed people around him, and one of the virtues was he could never remember quite when he got mad at you in 5 minutes. So his last year or two actually was a lovely journey for him. What we had to learn, and what some of you all caregivers may have to learn, is you had to be where he was, not where you are. And that was fine. It's something we learned. We have to know where Jesus is and be where Jesus is, right? Especially tonight. And he breathed his last. And yet, as lovely as all that was, I felt, and I still feel this very night, profound sorrow. No death is an easy death. It just isn't. And I ask us, what profound sorrow we feel for a kid named Isaac? Not the Bible Isaac, the seventh word Isaac. What profound sorrow do we feel each time creation is snuffed out by a gun or a bullet? You see, I cannot divorce our Victims of Violence Memorial from the crucifixion, and I refuse to, because of the profound loss and sorrow of a generation of largely young black men, and often young black children, but usually people of color. That's the burden we carry tonight. And they tell you in the seminary, as you wrap up your sermon, you're supposed to leave people with good news so they can leave feeling good. That is not what tonight is about. My wife asked me if she was a bad Christian because she wasn't coming to church tonight. I said no. She said, I know I'm supposed to feel guilty. I said, yes, you are. I don't know if guilt is what you should feel tonight, but I feel as the community of humanity, we all have a cross to bear. How you work that out in your own heart is how you will work it out. I will say that the more that you live into the crucifixion, the more that you try to reach up and grab some of the sorrow of God at the death of God's Son, the more you might reach out in sorrow for Isaac of the seventh ward. I need for you to understand the crucifixion, not in an intellectual capacity, but in a visceral capacity. I need you to feel the crucifixion in your gut. I need you to understand the profound pain and agony of loss, of human loss. And when we begin to understand that, we also value life more deeply, more richly. If you leave this night grieving the loss of Christ and beginning to grieve the loss of our names on that board, which I ask you to look at as you wander off home, you start to live into that crucifixion, the crucified God that Moltmann spoke of. And perhaps you might join me in at least speculating that somehow the creator of the universe learned how to mourn and learn sorrow that afternoon, on that moment. And in so learning, knew his people more deeply, more profoundly, more consistently. And in that knowing, could offer us even greater love than had ever been offered to us before. Out of sorrow into joy. There are no words of comfort tonight. There's simply the cross. Amen.